The book of Daniel comes in three languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Now, what's really interesting about the book of Daniel is that the Aramaic portions predate the Hebrew portions. And as we look at the Aramaic in the book of Daniel, we see it confined basically from chapters 2 through 7. There's a couple verses in the front of Daniel chapter 2, basically verses 1 through 4.5. That are in Hebrew, and then the rest of the book, the rest of the chapter is in Aramaic. And so that goes from chapters 2 to 7. So when you look at the book of Daniel and you read through it, if you're studying biblical Hebrew or you're just a student of scripture and studying the book of Daniel, but especially for the biblical Aramaic students, when you look at it, consider the Aramaic portions together, sort of as their own unit. And what we can see from those portions of the book of Daniel, it seems that that unit was designed together, right? Like it was put together based on what we can extract from our reading of it. So let's go ahead and just look, at the overview of these Aramaic chapters of the book of Daniel. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? He's dreaming about these what Daniel interprets as 4 kingdoms. And then the famous story in chapter 3 of the fiery furnace and the 3 holy youth. And chapter 4, the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 being the handwriting on the wall, that famous, line, mene tekel parsim. And then chapter 6 is when Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den. Finally, chapter 7 are the beasts that emerge from the sea. And then, of course, there's several other chapters that happen in Hebrew afterwards. But if we were to look at the Aramaic structure, long observed as a chiastic structure, so basically chapter 2 and chapter 7 parallel each other. You have a dream of 4 kingdoms and a vision of 4 kingdoms. In chapter 3 and chapter 6, you have Daniel's friends thrown into the fiery furnace, and in chapter 6, Daniel thrown into the lion's den. And then in between all that, in chapters 4 and 5, in chapter 4, there's the interpretation of the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and then in chapter 5, the interpretation of the handwriting on the wall. We get that phrase, the handwriting on the wall, or it's the writing on the wall, right, from this portion of the text. So while biblical Aramaic is limited in terms of the amount of text that it is when it compares to the rest of the Hebrew Bible, this chunk in the book of Daniel is the more substantial. The next being, the short account we get from the book of Ezra. And what we get in Daniel is a different type than the book of Ezra. And in Daniel, what we're getting from the Aramaic are these court stories, right? They're called court tales or court narratives, depending on what you read. But really, it's storytelling. And if you look at all of these, you can see the narrative story emerge, and it's going to play differently than the other Aramaic sections of the Hebrew scriptures, and namely the book of Ezra. So as you go through the collection of the Aramaic, try and keep in mind what are some of the verbal triggers? What sort of words are used to cue other words in the text? So as you go through reading the book of Daniel in Aramaic, go ahead and look at some of the specific terminology that's used and reused. How does one term maybe cue another term in later portions of the text? Jot these down as you read and share any insights you glean from these.